All right, so we're back with another deep dive, and this time we're tackling a trilogy that's pure '90s horror nostalgia. I know what you did last summer. We're
Yeah.
talking, the whole deal, rain, slickers, hooks, and those creepy whispers. I mean, come on,
Yeah.
you can't escape this franchise, even if you tried to bury it like a certain secret.
Yeah.
And hey, since you're the one who suggested this deep dive, I'm guessing these films hold a special place in your, heart.
Yeah. What's fascinating about this trilogy is how it really captures that 90s slasher revival. It breathes new life into those like classic horror tropes we love: secrets, revenge, and a killer who just refuses to stay
Oh,
dead.
for sure. Like literally
Yeah.
refuses to stay dead. So let's unpack that. Starting with the first film, we've got our core four, right? Julie, Helen, Barry, and Ray. To typical teens when they make a pretty life-altering mistake, that hit-and-run accident. But instead of doing the right thing, they decide to hide it, trying to bury the past, like literally.
And that's where the whole secrets never stay buried theme really kicks in, right? A year later, they find themselves tormented by this mysterious figure who seems to know exactly what they did. Talk about a rude
Oh
awakening.
yeah, big time.
Yeah.
And speaking of rude awakenings, remember those anonymous notes? I know what you did last summer.
Yeah.
Even just saying it out loud, it gives me chills. It's not just the threat. It's the constant reminder that someone is watching, judging their every move. That psychological tension is just masterful.
Totally agree. The film uses those notes so brilliantly to build suspense. It weaves them into this tapestry of, sudden appearances by the killer, chase scenes that leave you breathless. Like, remember Helen being chased through the Croker
Oh
Festival?
my gosh, yeah, hiding behind the pillow for sure. The way Gillespie uses those like quick cuts and tight angles, you feel like you're right there with her, feeling that panic. But something about the killer always kind of bugged me. It's like he's got this almost supernatural awareness. How does he always know where they are, what they're thinking?
That's a great point and a pretty common debate amongst fans. Does the killer have some impossible level of knowledge? Is it a plot hole?
Yeah.
Or is there something more going on? Like, could it be hinting at something deeper? A psychological connection between the killer and his victims? Does it work for you, or does it take you out of the movie?
Hmm. You know, honestly, this suspense is so well crafted that I can overlook a few inconsistencies. But yeah, I totally see how it could bother some viewers for sure. But you know what? Even with a mysterious, all-knowing killer on the loose, it's the characters that really got me invested.
Mm.
Like Julie, she's your classic final girl, but she's not just a helpless victim. She's dealing with so much guilt and fear, and you really feel that struggle.
Exactly. And she's not the only one of depth. Helen starts off as like the typical popular girl, but she transforms into someone so fiercely fighting for survival. And even Barry, the stereotypical jock, he has these moments of vulnerability that make him more than just a caricature.
Oh yeah, Barry totally surprised me. I was expecting him to just be the comic relief, but he actually has some really human moments that make you empathize with him. It's like even with their flaws, you're rooting for them to, make it out alive, which, let's be honest, is not always the case in slasher films.
Right. And that's one of the things that makes that first film so strong. It establishes those classic slasher archetypes, but then it gives the characters enough nuance to keep you engaged beyond just the stares.
Totally. So speaking of locations,
Mm.
let's swap the, sleepy town for some tropical terror, shall we? Because I still know what you did last summer whisks us away to the Bahamas, sunshine beaches, and a whole new set of nightmares.
Yeah, the sequel tries to like broaden the story a bit. This time Julie and Ray win a radio contest and they end up with their friends at a beautiful island resort. Sounds idyllic, right? Except, well, as we know, the past has a nasty habit of showing up uninvited.
Oh, for sure. It's like they're trying to outrun their guilt, but it follows them even to paradise.
Hmm.
Though, gotta admit, the plot gets a little messy, compared to the first film. What did you think about that whole son of the killer twist? Did that work for you?
I see what they were going for. Introduce a new element of revenge, raise the stakes. But honestly, it felt a bit convoluted. Adding the son into the mix just complicated things unnecessarily, I think. It muddled the emotional core of the story, which was really about these characters dealing with their past mistakes.
I agree. And the tone shifts too, wouldn't you
No.
say? It's still scary, but it leans more into graphic violence than that slow burn psychological dread from the first film. Remember that tanny bed scene?
Mm.
Definitely not for the squeamish.
Oh, absolutely. That scene is going for shock value over suspense for sure. But it's worth noting that even with the tonal shift, Julie's character development is still a highlight. She's facing her trauma head on and showing incredible resilience.
Yeah, she's definitely the heart of the franchise.
Hmm.
Sadly, the other characters in the sequel aren't given as much depth. It's almost like they're just
Fodder for the killer.
exactly,
Yeah.
which makes their deaths less impactful because we don't have that same emotional connection.
Right. It highlights a common challenge for horror sequels. How do you keep the scares fresh while also giving the audience characters they care about?
Yeah, it's a tough balance for sure.
Yeah.
But hey, that's what makes analyzing these movies so interesting, right? So ready to tackle the third installment? I'll
Yeah.
always know what you did last summer takes a bit of a different approach, to put it mildly.
Yeah, this third one, it definitely goes in a different direction. Instead of sticking with our original group, we get a whole new cast of characters and brand new story. It's like a bit of a reboot, I guess you could say. This time, it's a prank gone wrong that sets off a chain of events, and, well, you guessed, it leads to another killer with a hook.
Yeah, and I was so ready for another round of I Know What You Did Last Summer. But this one, it felt like it was just going through the motions.
Mm.
The suspense felt forced, the characters were paper thin, and the plot, well, let's just say it required a whole lot of suspension of disbelief.
It definitely falls into some of those generic slasher tropes. It loses that character development and psychological tension that made the first two films so effective. And what really throws things off is a tonal shift. The killer, who had this grounded, mysterious presence in the previous films, suddenly becomes this almost supernatural, zombie-like figure.
Yeah, it's like they were trying to hop on that whole teen horror craze of the late 90s, early 2000s where supernatural elements were everywhere.
Yeah.
But in doing so, they lost that sense of gritty realism that made the original so chilling.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
a classic example of a franchise trying to stay relevant but losing sight of what made it unique in the first place.
Okay, so we've gone through the highs and lows of the trilogy, but there's no denying that I Know What You Did Last Summer made a huge impact. I mean, even today you see references to these movies everywhere. Memes, Halloween costumes, you name it. Why do you think these movies, especially that first one, continue to resonate with audiences?
I think it's a combination of things. First, that first film tapped into a primal fear, right? That our past mistakes can come back to haunt us. It's a universal experience, that sense of guilt and the fear of being exposed. And then there's the nostalgia factor. For those who grew up in the 90s, these films are a reminder of a specific time in pop culture. That era of teen horror that was both terrifying and thrilling.
And let's not forget those iconic visuals, the fisherman's raincoat, the hook. You see those anywhere and you instantly know what it references.
Absolutely. Those images have become ingrained in our, collective horror vocabulary.
It's funny, even though the sequels didn't quite capture the magic of the original, they still hold a place in the history of horror sequels. They really highlight the challenges of keeping a franchise fresh, the struggle to balance fan expectations with creative innovation.
You said it. I still know what you did last summer. With its, tropical setting and attempt to expand the mythology. It shows how sequels often try to broaden the scope, sometimes at the expense of narrative cohesion.
And then, I'll always know what you did last summer. Well, not as successful reflects another common sequel trend. The soft reboot, introducing new characters and a new story while trying to maintain the essence of the original.
It's a reminder that sequels are often a balancing act, trying to appease existing fans while also attracting new audiences. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But it's always interesting to see how franchises evolve over time.
Speaking of evolution, it's worth noting that I Know What You Did Last Summer was part of a larger trend in 90s horror. This resurgence of the slasher genre. We had Scream, Urban Legend, and a whole wave of films that brought back those classic tropes with a modern twist. Why do you think that was? What was it about the 90s that made the slasher so popular again?
Well, I think part of it was a reaction to the more psychological atmospheric horror of the 80s. There was a desire for something more visceral, more immediate, more, blood-soaked.
Right. It was like audiences were ready for a return to those classic elements,
Right.
the masked killers, the chase scenes, the jump scares. But there was also a self-awareness to these 90s slashers, a meta-commentary on the genre itself.
Exactly. Films like Scream were not only terrifying, but they were also cleverly deconstructing the tropes of the genre,
Mhm.
pointing out the cliches and playing with audience expectations.
And I Know What You Did Last Summer, while not as overtly meta as Scream, still had a certain self-awareness. A wink at the audience that acknowledged the conventions of the slasher film.
It's a testament to the enduring appeal of the slasher, its ability to terrify, entertain, and even make us think about the nature of storytelling itself.
Looking back at these films now, it's interesting to see how they portray female characters. They're definitely strong and resourceful, but they also fall into some classic horror tropes. Julie, for example, fits the mold of the final girl, the one who survives while others fall victim. What do you think about that trope? Is it empowering but problematic or somewhere in between?
That's a great question, and one that deserves a nuanced discussion. On the one hand, the final girl is often the most intelligent, resourceful, and resilient character in the film. She's the one who outsmarts the killer, fights back, and ultimately survives. In that sense, she can be seen as a symbol of, female strength and resilience.
But on the other hand, the final girl trope often relies on certain gendered expectations.
Hmm.
She's often the virginal innocent one, the one who hasn't engaged in the bad behavior that supposedly leads to the deaths of her friends. And her survival is often dependent on her adherence to traditional feminine norms.
Right. There's often this underlying message that female characters need to be good in order to be worthy of survival, which is definitely problematic. It reinforces the idea that women are punished for their sexuality or for stepping outside of societal expectations.
And it's interesting to consider how those gender dynamics play out in I Know What You Did Last Summer, Julie, Helen, Carla. They're all strong characters in their own right, but they also face challenges and dangers that are specifically tied to their gender.
It's a reminder that even as we enjoy these films, it's important to be critical and examine how they portray female characters and what messages they might be sending about gender roles and expectations.
Absolutely. It's all part of being an informed and engaged viewer. And it adds another layer of complexity to our appreciation of these films. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on something we haven't discussed yet. The source material. The first I Know What You Did Last Summer film was actually based on a novel of the same name by Lois Duncan.
Oh, right. Lois Duncan, a legend in young adult suspense fiction. I devoured her books as a teenager. And it's fascinating to compare her novel to the film adaptation. While they share the core premise of the hit and run and the subsequent stalking, they diverge in some pretty significant ways.
For those who haven't read the book, it's a much more psychological thriller. It focuses on the emotional and psychological toll of guilt and secrecy on the characters. The killer's identity is different, and there's a greater emphasis on the internal struggles of the characters.
Duncan was a master at exploring the darker side of teenage life, the anxieties, the pressures, the secrets. And her novel is a chilling exploration of how guilt and fear can just eat away at you from the inside.
So for those who are interested in seeing where it all began, I highly recommend checking out Lois Duncan's novel. It offers a fascinating glimpse into the origins of the franchise and provides a very different take on the I Know What You Did Last Summer story.
It's a reminder that adaptations, while often drawing inspiration from their source material, can also take on a life of their own, reflecting the creative vision of the filmmakers and the cultural landscape of the time.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've discussed the films themselves, their cultural impact, the evolution of the slasher genre, and even the source material. It's been quite a journey. But as we head into the final part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with a thought-provoking question.
I'm all ears.
Why do you think we're so drawn to horror stories? What is it about these tales of stalking violence and suspense that captures our imaginations and keeps us coming back for more?
Yeah, it's a question that's been around forever, right? Why do we love to be scared?
Right. So many theories out there. Some say it's about confronting our fears, but in a safe environment, like getting a cathartic release or something. Others say it's more primal. It triggers our fight or flight response, gives us an adrenaline rush. Like a controlled dose of danger, right?
Yeah.
We get the thrill of fear, but without actually being in danger. And then there's that idea that horror can be like social commentary, using monsters and mayhem to explore societal anxieties and taboos.
That's a good point. Think about how many horror films reflect the fears of their time, Like those 80s slasher films with those masked, unstoppable killers, they often reflected that unease about violence and social breakdown.
And the I Know What You Did Last Summer movies, with their focus on guilt and secrets. It's like they're reflecting anxieties about privacy and the consequences of our actions, in a world that's so interconnected.
It's interesting, right? Horror as a mirror reflecting our deepest fears back at us. But it's also a genre that's always evolving, finding new ways to scare us and make us think.
Speaking of evolution, we talked about how I Know What You Did Last Summer was part of that 90s slasher revival. But the slasher genre didn't stop there. It's still evolving with new subgenres and trends popping up. What are some of the directions you've seen the slasher take lately?
Well, one interesting development is the rise of what some call elevated horror. These films still have the scares and gore, but they aim for something more, deeper themes, complex characters, and a more sophisticated approach to storytelling.
Oh, yeah, like Get Out, Hereditary, The
Yeah.
Babadook. They're terrifying, but they also stick with you because they're dealing with real issues like racism, family trauma, mental illness.
Exactly. They prove you can have both chills and substance. We're also seeing a lot more experimentation, blending horror with other genres, like sci-fi comedy, even romance.
It's like horror has become this playground for creative exploration. Yeah. Which is awesome for us horror fans. So many options. But let's circle back to our listener and their love for I Know What You Did Last Summer. If they're looking for more horror, what are some other films or franchises you'd recommend?
Well, if they're into that classic slasher formula, you can't go wrong with the originals. Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street. Those films basically created the genre, and they still hold up amazingly well.
And for more of that 90s slasher revival vibe, Scream and Urban Legend are definitely worth checking out. They've got that same blend of self-awareness, humor, and genuine scares that made I Know What You Did Last Summer so good.
If they want something more modern with a psychological twist, I'd recommend It Follows and The Guest. They both play with the stalker premise in really interesting ways, and they have characters you actually care about.
Oh, and for a truly unique and disturbing experience, Takashi Miike's Audition is a must-see. Just a heads up, though, it's not for the faint of heart. It's a Japanese horror film that will really get under your skin.
And for those who like the teen horror element, the Fear Street trilogy on Netflix is a lot of fun. It's a stylish take on the slasher blending classic tropes with supernatural stuff and a cool 80s and 90s aesthetic.
Plus, it's always cool to check out the source material. Lois Duncan's novel, I Know What You Did Last Summer, gives a totally different perspective on the story. It focuses more on the psychological impact of the characters' choices. It's a great read for fans of the film.
So many great options out there. It's a really good time to be a horror fan.
It really is. And as we wrap up this deep dive, it's wild to see how much we've covered. We started with 3 movies, and we've explored guilt secrets, revenge, the evolution of a genre, the psychology of fear.
It really shows the power of horror, its ability to entertain, provoke, make us think, and start conversations that go beyond the screen.
Totally. So to our listeners, you continue your own journey through the world of horror. Keep those questions in mind. What are your favorite horror tropes? What scares you the most? And what do your favorite horror films say about you and the world around you? Keep exploring, keep questioning, and most importantly,
keep watching.
And remember, be careful out there. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into I Know What You Did Last Summer.